Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to decode what is honestly a fascinating geopolitical mystery. We're unpacking the hidden strategy behind a U.S. president's sudden, highly public interest in a provincial Indian election. I mean, think about the irony for a second. You have a sitting U.S. president, a leader who is constantly navigating massive global crises, closely watching the ballot boxes in just one single Indian state. On the surface, a regional political contest like that seems literally worlds away from the Oval Office. But as we'll see in modern geopolitics, absolutely nothing is strictly local. Okay, so let's dive right into this. We're starting at the surface level with a very, very unusual diplomatic event. Typically, world leaders congratulate each other on massive national victories, right? A new prime minister, a new president. Honestly, most world leaders barely have the time to track their own state elections, let alone regional ones taking place completely on the other side of the globe. Granular attention like that is incredibly rare. So, the big question we need to answer today is simply this. Why is Donald Trump weighing in on an internal Indian state election? What are the actual stakes here? Part 1. An unusual presidential congratulation. Let's look at the timeline of this message. In May 2026, a massive political shift happens in the Indian state of West Bengal, and Washington reacts surprisingly fast. Right after the results, the White House released a glowing endorsement through their spokesman, Kush Desai. He said, "The president congratulates Prime Minister Modi on this recent, historic, and decisive election victory." Desai even added that the president believes India is lucky to have Modi as its leader. Just notice the specific words used there: historic, decisive. This is a massive contrast to those standard, perfectly sterile diplomatic press releases we are also used to seeing. It's a wildly enthusiastic message for a regional outcome. But, as you might expect, that enthusiasm wasn't welcomed by everyone on the ground. Yeah, not everyone was thrilled. Indian Member of Parliament Sanjay Raut publicly pushed back against the statement. He noted that these are state-level elections, which are strictly an internal matter of India's federal democracy. He called the external endorsement premature and misplaced. He even tagged the U.S. president directly on social media. He was essentially telling a foreign leader to step back and stay out of domestic matters, especially since this specific election was already surrounded by intense, very localized debates. That brings us to Part 2, the historic Bengal election. To truly understand the why behind Washington's message, we have to look at what actually went down in West Bengal. The May 2026 results were, by all accounts, completely historic. Prime Minister Modi's party, the BJP, won a staggering 207 out of 294 seats. This unseated the incumbent Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee and ended her party's 15-year rule. Think about this. It marked the very first time a right-wing party was elected in Bengal since assembly elections even began there back in 1937. And the public engagement? Unparalleled. A 92.93% voter turnout that completely dwarfs typical Democratic voter turnouts in the West. This was just a monumental domestic victory for Modi's party. Now, you might be wondering, okay, great local win, but so what? Well, this brilliantly illustrates why these seemingly local elections matter globally. In India's federal system, border states act as the literal gateways for international trade and treaties. West Bengal shares a massive, porous border with Bangladesh. Key international treaties, like the Major Teesta Water Sharing Agreement, actually require consensus from the state government. By securing Bengal, Modi's national government gains unprecedented alignment between state and central policies. It suddenly makes the local chief minister a major player in Modi's broader foreign policy toolkit, completely smoothing the way for massive geopolitical maneuvers. Which leads us to Part 3, bromance to breakdown. Why does Donald Trump care so much about this specific domestic win? To get that, we have to look at the recent, very volatile history of U.S.-India trade relations. We've got to track this absolute diplomatic whiplash from 2025 to 2026. The relationship was spiraling into a brutal trade war. It starts with reciprocal tariffs in April 2025. Then by August, the U.S. slaps an extra 25% penalty on India, specifically for buying Russian oil. Boom! Indian goods are suddenly facing a crippling 50% tariff. But then, a crucial turning point happens. The U.S. president's own domestic courts begin stripping away his favorite negotiating weapon. In February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down reciprocal tariffs. And in May 2026, a federal court strikes down universal tariffs. Suddenly, the White House's leverage is evaporating. Part 4. The multi-billion-dollar trade deal. Facing that sudden, steep loss of leverage from the courts, the U.S. had to pivot, and pivot fast. They urgently pushed for a historic trade pact in February 2026, realizing they could no longer force terms through tariffs. Look at this massive reversal. To pull India away from Russian oil, the U.S. dropped those crippling 50% tariffs down to just 18% as a huge peace offering. And in exchange for that leniency, India agreed to a monumental shift in its own foreign policy, committing to stop purchasing Russian crude oil. It was a huge geopolitical win for Washington, for sure, but it came with a hefty price tag and required locking in some massive ongoing commitments. In exchange for the tariff relief, India committed to opening its market of 1.4 billion people. They promised to buy over $500 billion in American energy, information technology, and coal. They also agreed to lower tariffs on American agricultural goods and actually sit down to negotiate new digital trade rules. Securing these $500 billion commitments is the ultimate prize of these ongoing trade deal negotiations. Keeping India at the table and keeping them happy is absolutely essential to locking this whole thing in. Just to ground the sheer scale of this relationship for a second, the total U.S.-India trade in 2024 alone was an estimated $212.3 billion. Let that number sink in. The U.S. is India's largest single-country trading partner. You simply cannot overstate how critical this economic corridor is to both nations. And hey, it's not just about the current numbers, it's about the future trajectory. Amid widespread global sluggishness and very real fears of a global recession, economic reports view India as a rare, relative oasis of growth. Washington needs India just as much, if not more, than India needs Washington right now. For a U.S. administration looking to boost its own economy, securing preferential access to the world's most resilient emerging market isn't just a nice-to-have goal, it is a total necessity. Which perfectly tees up Part 5, Tactics Behind the Tweet. We have the motive, we have the fragile trade deal, and we have a loss of leverage. So how does it all connect back to that one congratulatory message? Because the timing here is everything. On May 7, 2026, a U.S. federal court officially struck down the president's 10% universal tariffs. That ruling fundamentally weakened the White House's ability to force trade terms on global partners. The big stick they'd been using to threaten countries was suddenly broken. And get this, it happened just days before the results of the Bengal election were finalized. The White House was suddenly desperate for a new way to keep Prime Minister Modi locked into those ongoing trade negotiations. When you lay it out step by step, the strategy is incredibly clear. Step 1. The U.S. administration loses its aggressive tariff leverage due to the domestic court rulings. Step 2. They realize they desperately need to ensure that the fragile $500 billion trade deal stays intact, even without the threat of tariffs holding it together. Step 3. They pivot hard to soft diplomacy. The congratulatory tweet wasn't just a polite nod. It was the lubricant for the ongoing trade deal negotiations. Without tariffs to force compliance, the president had to use flattery. It was essentially a strategic deposit in the diplomatic bank account to ensure the ongoing negotiations didn't collapse. And honestly, Washington didn't really have a backup plan, because the global mood was already souring. Other world leaders were publicly stating that hasty trade deals signed under the threat of U.S. tariffs weren't worth the paper they were printed on. It's fascinating. We are watching a superpower pivot from the hard power of tariffs directly to the soft power of flattery, simply because their own court system and global resistance forced their hand. Flattery literally replaced tariffs as the tool of choice to safeguard their geopolitical interests. Which brings us to a pretty profound realization. In a hyper-connected world, a ballot cast in a provincial election doesn't just decide local roads or schools, it ripples all the way to the Oval Office, forcing superpowers to completely rewrite their global trade strategies on the fly. When a regional vote in West Bengal serves as the direct leverage point to influence ongoing negotiations for a $500 billion global trade pact, we really have to ask ourselves, does local politics actually exist anymore? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, remember, in modern geopolitics, there is no such thing as just local.